term monotheism, with special reference to Madame Blavatsky and her notion of Kabbalah. The term monotheism was developed in the 19th century in tandem with various agendas, especially colonialist ones. And I'm going to show that Blavatsky participated in this 19th century discourse on monotheism, and I want to contextualize her statements with reference to Jean-François Champollion, the Egyptologist, Ernest Renan, Christian Lassen, and Friedrich Müller. I'm going to show that although the basic notion of the wise ancients versus the dogmatic and intolerant Western Christian church remain constant from the Isis Unveiled of 1877 to the Secret Doctrine of 1888, Blavatsky's use of the term monotheism changed. At first, she sided with Champollion and others to say that the ancients had been monotheists despite their polytheistic appearances, and that Christians were pretend monotheists. Blavatsky therefore transvalued the concept of monotheism with respect to the commonplace perception that Egyptians and others were polytheists and the Christians were monotheists. However, by the time she wrote Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky seems to have given up trying to rehabilitate the term monotheism to fit her notion of the wise ancients. She performed a second transvaluation of the term, thereby making monotheism synonymous with ignorance and oppression. She wasn't the first to give a negative interpretation of monotheism. Arthur Schopenhauer, for example, writing in around the middle of the century, connected monotheism with intolerance and polytheism with tolerance. Nonetheless, European thought in general had understood progress as including the march towards monotheism, especially in its Christian form. Blavatsky's position in the Secret Doctrine was a reversal of the dominant Enlightenment view that monotheism is the highest and most rational form of religion. In an anti-monotheist polemic, Blavatsky juxtaposed monotheism with the emanationist Secret Doctrine, with its impersonal divine source, a doctrine supposedly articulated by the peaceful Kabbalists and others who had been the targets of the violent and intolerant Christian church. This Secret Doctrine became the site for a synthesis of Blavatsky's understanding of the Kabbalistic Ein Sof and the Neo-Vedantic Para-Brahman as the impersonal source of the cosmos. I suggest that Blavatsky's juxtaposition of monotheism and the Secret Doctrine is part of a wider polarization of opposites that's present in Blavatsky's writings, a fact which reflects the founder cultural trends that also included such polarizations as East and West, male and female, and Aryan and Semitic. Seemingly, ironically, despite these polarizations, or perhaps sometimes even through them, Blavatsky attempted to achieve various forms of unification. Questions surrounding Orientalism and identity are central, and I'll be discussing these with reference to Blavatsky's politics, her anti-Catholicism, her anti-Protestantism, and especially her stance against missionary activity in India. Let's look at the term monotheism in the 19th century. Clearly the notion that there's only one God has been put forward at various times and in various forms throughout history and is associated with so-called monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. However we choose to describe these various formulations of belief in one God, the term monotheism has been found by scholars of religion to be problematic. For example, in reference to the study of Indian religions, Wendy Doniger argues that Hindu thought is both polytheistic and monotheistic, and that the question of whether it's one or the other is often driven by political motivations. In another example, Peter Heyman, in his address to the British Association for Jewish Studies, argued that the term monotheism is misused in Jewish studies, since it is an inaccurate description of Jewish conceptions of divinity, which in fact include many divine beings. One reason that the term monotheism has been found to be unsatisfactory in specific contexts is that it's not a term that belongs to the periods and texts studied themselves, but is instead the product of 19th century scholarship that attempted to classify religion according to certain value judgments. It seems that the term was coined by Henry More, the Cambridge Platonist, in 1680, in a very different way to that in which it's understood today, as a derogatory term for Unitarian beliefs. Henry More's use of monotheism postdates the first appearance of the term polytheism and polytheist by about 50 years. These terms were used by Christian theologians from the 16th and 17th centuries in association with idolatry, paganism, and immorality. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term monotheism appears in print for only the third time in the early 19th century. The terms polytheism, monotheism, henotheism, pantheism, and others were thereafter developed by 19th century scholars in tandem with one another. Theories about the superiority of monotheism were developed in the 19th century in the context of colonial expansion, serving the assertion of the religious and cultural superiority of European Enlightenment values such as reason, progress, and morality. There were many different theories concerning the origins, development, and nature of monotheism during the 19th century. These included different versions of the progressivist evolutionary view that religion evolved towards monotheism through various stages, including animism, totemism, polytheism, and henotheism. And that's represented on the top line. Reflecting the romantic notion of decay and decline, theories also included multiple versions of the idea that an original pure monotheism had, for various reasons, become corrupted, and that's represented on the lower line there. Regardless of the details, the value judgment was almost always that monotheism was the highest form of religion. An excellent example comes from the entry for theism in the article written for the 1889 9th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica by Edinburgh Professor of Divinity Robert Flint. Flint discussed a number of different theories before concluding that the vast majority of recent anthropologists hold that religion originates in some rude phase of polytheism and that monotheism has everywhere been preceded by polytheism. Flint stated that Israel was the first example of a monotheistic nation, but even Israel had not started out as monotheistic, but had arrived at monotheism following earlier phases. He argued that in the measure in which reason advances either on the path of scientific investigation, or of philosophical speculation, polytheism must retreat and disappear. In the measure in which it discerns unity, order, system, moral government, indications of spiritual character and design in the world, monotheism must rise and spread. Another example of the association of monotheism with Enlightenment values comes from Ramohan Roy, the famous father of the Hindu Renaissance, and founder of the Hindu Unitarian syncretist movement, the Brahmo Samaj, which included Neo-Vedantic elements. The notion of monotheism was one of Roy's central tenets, and he argued that Vedanta was, in fact, monotheistic. He saw so-called Hindu idolatry as a corruption of the original Indian monotheistic religion. In the encyclopedia entry, Flint applauded Roy as an example of the transcendence of polytheism through piety, writing that Brahmoism is perhaps the most remarkable example of a Unitarian theism which exhibits all the characteristics of a positive faith and a churchly organization. Both Flint and Roy's assessments are excellent illustrations of the ways in which the term monotheism was developed in the 19th century in polemical and colonialist contexts and in the service of the Enlightenment ideals of reason, progress, science, and morality. Moving on now to Blavatsky, although the juxtaposition between the wise ancients and the corrupt Western Christian church remained constant in her writings, Blavatsky spoke about monotheism with different voices, playing with the term to suit her purposes. Surprise, surprise. Whereas in Isis Unveiled, she had been concerned to show that the ancients had been monotheists despite polytheistic appearances, in the secret doctrine, she seems to have given up on ascribing a positive value to monotheism. Whereas previously she'd accepted the notion that monotheism is a good thing and always qualified her descriptions of Christian religion with the term pretend monotheism, in her later work, monotheism itself became a dirty word. Blavatsky's position in ISIS was that Jehovah was one of the many gods of the neighbouring nations who was revered as part of the Mosaic sun and serpent worship. The Jewish religion, she argued, included some slight monotheistic notions, but these were crammed in by Ezra when he rewrote the Pentateuch. Arguing that the Bible was corrupted, she rejected what she called a pretend monotheistic scripture, made up just when the priests of Jerusalem found their political profit in violently breaking off all connection with the Gentiles. It's at this moment only that we find them persecuting Kabbalists and banning the old wisdom of both pagans and Jews. The highlights are mine, by the way, that I added for emphasis, where she's talking about political profit and persecution. The Kabbalists, according to Blavatsky, had taught the true doctrine that Ein Sof emanates Adam Kadmon, which is the same as Brahma or Logos. It's this second level of emanation that's involved in the creation of the cosmos, not the higher impersonal level. Thus, the emanationist doctrine already in Isis became the site for a synthesis of Kabbalistic, Hindu and Platonic elements as she understood them. This emanationist teaching, she argued, overturns, as we've remarked, the whole elaborate system of Christian theology, for it proves that behind the creative deity there was a higher God, a planner, an architect, and that the former was but his executive agent, a simple power. They persecuted the Gnostics, murdered the philosophers, and burned the Kabbalists and the Masons. And when the day of the great reckoning arrives and the light shines in the darkness, what will they have to offer in the place of the departed, expired religion? What will they answer these pretended monotheists, these worshippers and pseudo-servants of the one living God, to their creator? Note the polemical tone, as well as the fact that Blavatsky here refers to Ein Sof as a higher God, a planner, or an architect, terms with personal implications. Finally, we may note that the true doctrine, as articulated by the ancients, including the Egyptians, was associated with a profound monotheism. Despite their apparent polytheism, the ancients, those of the educated class at all events, were entirely monotheistical. And this to ages upon ages before the days of Moses. Eminent men were called gods by the ancients. The deification of mortal men and supposititious gods is no proof against their monotheism. The merit of Champollion as an Egyptologist none will question. He declares that everything demonstrates the ancient Egyptians to have been profoundly monotheistical. Blavatsky's statement here refers to a contemporary debate in Egyptology about whether Egyptian religion was monotheistic, polytheistic, or pantheistic. The Egyptologist Gaston Masperon, for example, argued that the ancient Egyptians had been polytheists. Jean-François Champollion, on the other hand, referred to the Egyptian religion as a pure monotheism, which manifested itself externally by symbolic polytheism. And it was with this position that Blavatsky initially aligned herself. Is it possible to see that?
Yeah.
You can even possibly make it bigger. Anyway, okay. Other contemporary Egyptologists who believed Egyptian religion to be monotheistic included Lepage Renouf, Heinrich Busch, and Emmanuel de Rouget, famous as having ideas similar to ideas that eventually influenced Freud's Moses and monotheism. Anyway, moving on now to Renan and Muller. Blavatsky's denial that monotheism began with Moses also reflects contemporary debates about the origins of monotheism. Central to the field of comparative philology, the most prominent figures in these debates were the Hebrews or the Semites and the Aryans or the Indo-Europeans, who by the time Blavatsky wrote had already been engaged in various activities in the Western imagination for decades. The central problem for comparative mythologists and philologists involved finding a way of accounting for the fact that the Hebrews were inferior to the Aryans, but were nevertheless the first to embrace monotheism. From around the mid-19th century to the early 20th century, Friedrich Max Müller, seen here, impressed the world with his theories about the history and origins of religion, language, and mythology. We'll be hearing more about him shortly, right? Müller argued that the science of religion shows that there's a natural idea of the divine, that this degenerates into polytheism and mythology as the natural result of unavoidable linguistic processes. Through philological work, genuine spirituality could be found beneath this mythological crust. The first volume of Müller's 1868 Chips from a German Workshop contained an entire chapter in which he critiqued the notion of monotheism of his friend Ernest Renan. Renan was very influential, especially in France in the second half of the 19th century, and played an important part in the debate over monotheism. Renan himself had been influenced by Christian Lassen, who had argued that the white Caucasian race included two branches, the Indo-Europeans and the Semites. According to Lassen, Semitic narcissism had led to an intolerant and fanatical religion. This Semitic fanaticism and missionizing was foreign to the tolerant Indo-Germans whose freedom of thought had enabled the rise of advanced philosophical and scientific theories. Müller's chapter explicitly critiqued Renan, who had argued that the Semitic race was monotheistic by instinct. Reminiscent of Christian Lassen, Renan had argued that the Semitic character is religious rather than political, and the mainspring of their religion is the conception of the unity of God. Their religious phraseology is simple and free from mythological elements. Their religious feelings are strong, exclusive, and intolerant. Their political life has remained patriarchal and despotic. For Renan, the Semites were not superior to others, and they did not invent monotheism. Instead, arid, grandiose monotheism arose from the incapacity of the Hebrew language to describe abstract terms. Monotheism came naturally to the Semite with his limited capacity for imagination and expression. Although it led to monotheism, the limitations of the Hebrew language also condemned the Semitic race to stagnation. On the other hand, Aryan mythology was said to arise from freedom of thought and imagination, qualities that ultimately lead to the development of science. For Renan, supposed Semitic paganism was always a mask for primitive monotheism, so that once again we have the view that in certain cases, apparent polytheism is in fact monotheism in disguise. The Semitic race fulfilled its destiny by bequeathing the gift of monotheism to the Aryan people, which brought it to fulfillment in the moderate monotheism of Christianity, associated with rationality and science, and which ultimately became an Aryan rather than a Semitic religion. Max Müller agreed with the view that the history of the civilized world had been acted on by the Semitic and the Aryan races, but he disagreed with Renan's notion of a Semitic monotheistic instinct. In the development of religions, a primitive intuition or inherent theism available to all people tended to be followed by the attribution of different characteristics to the one divine power, known as kathenotheism. Müller added another term, henotheism, meaning that while a particular god is invoked, it shares all the attributes of the Supreme Being. Over time, religion had a tendency to degenerate into polytheism as a result of the inadequacies or disease of language. The Jews, he pointed out, contra Renan, were not monotheistic by instinct, and had lapsed into polytheism numerous times. Similarly, among the Aryans, mythology prevailed, and the negation of multiple gods was even more difficult. Muller argued that the development of monotheism from polytheism explained the presence of the plural Elohim in Genesis. Muller wrote that Abraham saw that all the Elohim were meant for God, and thus Elohim, comprehending by one name everything that ever had been or could be called divine, became the name with which the monotheistic age was rightly inaugurated. It proves better than anything else that the true monotheism could not have risen except on the ruins of a polytheistic faith. In answer to how the Semites became monotheists after their descent into polytheism, Max Muller argued that it was through a special divine revelation from God to Abraham, which passed to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Max Muller's comparative mythology was what Maurice Olander has termed a strategic, as well as a sacred science. A Christian who believed all religion to be founded on the same divine intuition, Muller encouraged Christian missionaries to highlight the similarities between different religions, even if Christianity was the highest. And as Stefan Arvidsson has observed, Max Muller's theory advocated a liberal, reformed Christianity and legitimated the power of the British Raj. According to Muller, the Indians and the Europeans are two branches of the same Aryan family. The former degenerated into Hinduism, whereas the latter had had the advantage of embracing Christian monotheism. Since the British were also Aryans, they would lead the Indians back to monotheism through Christianity. The reunion of the two branches of the Aryan family would therefore occur through the British Raj, and Muller's work as an Orientalist would have real political consequences. Blavatsky was familiar with the work of both Renan and Muller, both of whom she mentioned extensively in Isis Unveiled, and neither of whom she accepted uncritically, reframing the issue of monotheism vis-à-vis theosophy to suit her own perspectives. In The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky transvalued monotheism again. Gone was the notion that the ancients were monotheists. Gone too was a description of Ein Sof as a higher god with personal characteristics. What we do have in The Secret Doctrine is the unequivocal assertion that monotheism involves the misguided elevation of the phallic deity Jehovah, in fact merely one of the Elohim, for the sake of power and profit. The monotheist is now characterized as an oppressive, ignorant, and dogmatic blasphemer who, unlike the theosophist, disobeys his or her own Bible. If we, theosophists, are taken to task for believing in operating gods and spirits while rejecting a personal God, we answer to the theists and monotheists: admit that your Jehovah is one of the Elohim, and we are ready to recognize him. Make of him as you do the infinite, the one and the eternal God, and we will never accept him in this character. Of tribal gods there were many. The one universal deity is a principle, an abstract, root idea, which has naught to do with the unclean work of finite form. We do not worship the gods, we only honour them as being superior to ourselves. In this, we obey the Mosaic injunction, while Christians disobey their Bible, missionaries and foremost of all. Note here the denigration of missionaries in particular, as well as the rejection of an anthropomorphic or personal God, a notion that is now associated with monotheism, not pretend monotheism. We deny the anthropomorphic God of the monotheists, but never the divine principle in nature. We combat Protestants and Roman Catholics on a number of dogmatic theological beliefs of human and sectarian origin. Blavatsky identified the Kabbalistic Ein Sof with the Vedantic Parabrahman as the impersonal source of a fourfold emanation cosmos. The unknowable referred to in various ways Blavatsky's quote again. The unknowable referred to in various ways in Rig Vedic verse, such as naught was, called later on Parabrahm, the Ein Nothing, or the Ein Sof of the Kabbalists, and again the Spirit of God that moves upon the face of the water in Genesis, all these are identical. Like Muller, Blavatsky hoped that her project would have real political consequences. They were just the opposite of Muller's. Portraying herself as a sort of theosophical missionary, Blavatsky hoped to undermine both the British Raj and associated mission efforts in India. This was related to her differing valuation of monotheism and of Christianity. For Muller, the plural Elohim was evidence of a former, more primitive, polytheistic phase in Israelite religion prior to the monotheistic revelation. For Blavatsky, the Elohim really exist and are associated with the emanations of Ein Sof that are involved in the creation of the world. In other words, the term Elohim is evidence of the error, not the truth, of monotheism. For both Muller and Blavatsky, then, the articulation of the name of God inaugurated the monotheistic age. In Muller's case, Elohim; in Blavatsky's case, Jehovah. For Muller, this was a divine revelation. For Blavatsky, a disaster. I was once told by a scholar of theosophy that Blavatsky opposed monotheism because she was a monist, but although it's true to some extent, I don't think that that's a sufficient explanation. In my view, it's this juxtaposition of the secret doctrine and monotheism as polar opposites that requires not only explanation but also some kind of historical contextualization. In his work on representations of Tibet, Donald Lopez referred to a play of opposites: the authentic and the derivative, the holy and the demonic, the good and the bad. This opposition, Lopez argued, has functioned throughout the history of Europe's relation to Asia, West and East, Occident and Orient, each a historical rather than a geographical construct. Peter Bishop's noted that Western images of Tibet are usually mirrored by an image of the West, and that fascination with Tibet mirrors dissatisfaction with the West. To this picture, there's Blavatsky in conversation with Max Muller. To this picture, we may now add Blavatsky's concept of monotheism, to sit alongside the Western, the inauthentic, and the exoteric in her own play of opposites, the flip side of which is the Eastern, the authentic, and the esoteric. This tendency towards polarized thinking is reflected in other polarizations of the fin de siècle period, not only between East and West, but also between male and female, science and religion, and of course Aryan and Semite, as we've seen. As Wouter Hanegraaff has argued, from the 18th and 19th centuries, esotericists constructed their identities as such by adopting Protestant and Enlightenment notions of the rejected esoteric other and defending these against orthodoxy. Blavatsky's own polarization is related to her construction of her own identity as an esotericist in opposition to a Western, Christian, and significantly monotheistic other, in a reversal of the dominant view of monotheism as articulated, among other places, in the growing sciences of comparative mythology, philology, and Egyptology, as I've shown. So her defense was against not only the religious, but also the scientific orthodoxy of her day. Her choice of other reflects the anti-authoritarianism, antinomianism even, that seems to have been part of her personality and was part of an anti-clerical and anti-colonial stance that she shared with certain sections of the spiritualist movement in which she had participated. As Peter van der Veer has argued, spiritualism and theosophy played important roles in the development of radical anti-establishment and anti-colonial policies, both in India and in Europe. What can we say about the place of Kabbalah in this? First, in Blavatsky's work, a Victorian occultist reading of Kabbalah based on certain specific sources converged with European knowledge of Indian religions, in particular Neo-Vedanta, in a colonial context. Second, Kabbalah participated in Blavatsky's anti-monotheist polemic, in which Ein Sof was pitted against Jehovah, a dichotomy which has a place among the numerous perceived oppositions of the period. Third, Kabbalah had an important place in Blavatsky's construction of her identity as an esotericist, a fact which reflects her anti-establishment politico-spirituality. Thus, Kabbalah was used to combat Protestantism and Catholicism, and especially missionary activity in India. Fourth, Blavatsky, like many before her, separated Kabbalah from Judaism, but in her own very specific way. We know that the notion that Kabbalah is not really Jewish was expressed in occultist and academic literature alike, but before we move away from this point, let's examine the place of Kabbalah within Blavatsky's larger scheme a little more closely. Blavatsky taught that there are 7 root races, not races in the sense commonly understood today, but successive and radically different stages of evolution as it occurs on the planet. With the exception of certain tribal and aboriginal peoples who are believed to be dying out, all those so-called civilized people alive at the time of Blavatsky's writing were considered to belong to one or other of the various sub-races of the Aryan root race, which was the 5th of 7. The previous root race, the 4th, were giants in possession of advanced scientific and magical knowledge who had lived on Atlantis until their destruction in the deluge. Their wisdom was subsequently passed on to their descendants, the Aryan root race, which arose in Asia. Crucially, the Semites, including the Jews and the Arabs, were said to be a later Aryan subrace. Thus, Sanskrit was seen as the mother of all languages, and the Semitic languages were its bastard descendants. Kabbalah, a term which is often used by Blavatsky more or less synonymously with the secret doctrine, is therefore ultimately of Atlantean origin. Therefore, it's originally no more Hindu or Buddhist than it is Jewish. The Atlantean Kabbalah was received first by the Hindu Aryans, who expressed it in the Advaita Vedanta, then subsequently by the Semitic Aryans, a later subrace of the same Aryan family. This is why, in her outline of the fourfold emanationary cosmos, Blavatsky states that the Aryan and the Semitic theoanthropographies are 2 leaves on the same stem. This wasn't a complete unification, of course, since Blavatsky also argued that the Semites were degenerate in spirituality and that the Semitic Kabbalah was relatively more corrupted. Referring to Hebrew as a bastard descendant of Sanskrit is also hardly flattering. Nonetheless, although Blavatsky used the same terms, it's important to acknowledge what is different about her perspective on the Semites and the Aryans. Unlike those philologists who sought to explain the incongruous monotheism of an unquestionably inferior race, the question that underlay Blavatsky's project was as different as her answer. How do we explain the unfortunate appearance of monotheism at a later point in the history of humanity? So in conclusion, Blavatsky's argument that the Semites are simply later Aryans is another example of how, despite her various polarizations, the overall aim of Blavatsky's project was unification, a genderless, impersonal divinity that's the source of both male and female principles, a reconciliation of science and religion in the science religion of Theosophy, and the reunification of East and West. Both the polarizations and the attempted unifications are emblematic of the fin de siècle trends, a relatively short period at the end of the Victorian era, which, for example, brought us not only the reification and polarization of gender categories, but also such figures as the supposedly masculine new woman and the feminine dandy. In other words, with its polarizations and unifications, the secret doctrine is a fin de siècle work that attempted to provide solutions to the various intellectual, spiritual, and political crises of the period, and Kabbalah had an important place in this project. These developments arose in a Victorian world in which the definitions of terms such as Aryan, Semite, science, religion, and monotheism were contested and negotiated in a growing body of professional and scientific literature. Blavatsky's participation in the wider 19th century debate about the valences of monotheism and the way in which she drew Kabbalah into this discussion seems to have provided, for Blavatsky at least, part of the answer to her own personal crisis of faith. Thank you. Good.
have about 5 minutes for questions, comments. Please.
Since the term dualism was introduced into scholarly discussion about the same period, 1700, by Thomas Haidt, and after that in the 19th century played a role in these discussions that you discussed, I was curious whether Blavatsky ever used it while discussing polytheism and monotheism in the way Albert Pike did it in The Moral and Dogma of the Scottish Rite, trying his own esoteric comparative religion sort of answer to Max Muller.
That was just a harmless thought. I'm not sure if she uses the term dualism. She certainly uses all those different terms, polytheism, monotheism, etc. I'd have to look into the use of the term dualism if there is one. Does anyone else know? It's never struck me as a term. I probably would have clocked it if she had. Say again. Yeah. I'm hoping to develop this, to look at her use of all these different terms and the different. This is just like one part of a wider project that I'm doing. And yeah.
Please.
And monotheism is a term when Christian missionary criticized ancient religions and praise their superiority to ancient religions. But in Japan, Buddhists use the term pantheism, pantheism to explain the superiority of Buddhism to the Christianity. And that Blavatsky use term pantheism or
yeah,
something?
she does. Yeah, she does. That's part of these discussions. She uses it. I think she uses it in a number of different ways. There are certainly debates going on at the time in which they're accused of pantheism, or in which she feels like she has to justify their doctrines which can be perceived as pantheism. Yeah, for sure.
One last question, Andreas.
Yeah, I wonder whether the problem that Blavatsky had with monotheism and her search for alternatives is a kind of a revival of what happened in Romanticism in Germany, and probably also not only in Germany. I mean, the debate on monotheism in Germany was mainly in the 18th century, not in the 19th century. It was actually the classical position of the Enlightenment, of the Haskalah, of the Masculine on the one hand, on the other hand the Protestant Enlightenments. And what then Romanticism did was a kind of revival of polytheism, pantheism against this type of Enlightenment monotheism. So I think already around 1800 you have this effect against monotheism as rationalization, Verwissenschaftlichung, etc., of demystification. So I think this is quite rather similar. So if you look at from this debate, what Blavatsky does seems to be something like a neo-romantic position.
Right.
So
I
if
knew
you
that
read, for
Blavatsky
example,
was a neo.
Schellen's Philosophie der Mythologie or Schlegel, so in Germany prove the same arguments, and Schlegel is also going back to India in order to prove something against the monotheism.
Schopenhauer.
Schopenhauer we mentioned, but Schopenhauer is later, so it's
He was already in the middle.
yeah.
So
it's
Blavatsky's a
already
bit
around
late
1800
then.
You have the same discussion in Germany.
Right.
It's very interesting. So it's, and the positions, the arguments are extremely similar to what you explained.
Okay, so Blavatsky was a kind of later articulation of themes that had already been discussed quite a long time ago in Germany.
Well,
Yep.
you just
Quick comment?
Yeah, maybe it would be interesting to have a look at the possible influence of American transcendentalism here as a mediator between German Romanticism and
Okay, that leaves us. Thank you very much.